Hey guys, today we're going to do a sketch and then a Photoshop rendering of the Hoka Tour Summit 2 shoe. So I got my fancy microphone set up here, and we're going to go through this sketch. So usually when I start off a sketch, I'm just going to do a light pass with a light marker. So I just have like a 20% Prismacolor marker here. And I'm just kind of feeling out the overall proportions. It's okay if I make a bunch of mistakes here. So I'm just laying out the basic shape, and then I'm going to come back and add the details later. So basically this marker is like a 20%, so it's okay if I mess up a lot, and you can see as I'm kind of roughing everything out. It's not perfect. I'm just kind of getting the basic shapes in there. So the first thing I'm trying to do is get the overall shape and then block out the different parts, like the upper of the shoe, the lower, and just laying out some of the details, like the placement of the eyelets of the shoe, and then the different layers of the base. So here I'm putting in some of the details, like on the sole of the shoe. I'm starting to kind of nail down the overall shape, the outline of the shoe, like the silhouette. So I'm coming back in with a little bit darker marker and kind of nailing down the outline of the shoe. So now I'm kind of going in, adding a little bit more detail. So I'm putting in the different eyelets, adding in the laces, some of the details like the loop on the back, and then the tongue of the shoe. So now I'm pretty happy with the overall proportion at this point. So now I'm just coming back with the technical pen and starting to put in the line work. Now the line work with the technical pen, it's black ink. So when I take this into Photoshop, the light marker is going to end up disappearing or sort of fading into the background. So all the little mistakes in the marker are going to disappear, which is exactly what we want. So what I'm doing now is I'm starting to add in some of the little details and putting in the different divots and cuts in the foam, adding in the details on the rivets. And these are the areas that are going to pick up the light and the shadow part when I start to render the shoe. So now I'm adding in the laces here, kind of putting in some of the small details, little pieces of stitching, the logo, little details like wording on the side. I'll put in like a ground shadow in there. Okay, so now I've basically taken a picture of this, and I just took a picture of it on my phone. I don't even have a scanner. I just took a picture with my phone on the longest zoom to get the image nice and flat so there's no distortion or anything. So took that picture into Photoshop. And basically what I did is adjust the levels of the sketch to kind of fade some of the marker lines out. And so the black outline of the pen stands out. So what I'm doing here is filling in color blocks for different parts of the shoe. So when I look at the shoe, I'm separating it out into materials like the sole, the upper, and the laces. And basically I'm making on a new layer each area of color. So here what I've done is made a selection with the pen tool of just the upper part of the shoe. So everything I've made in green here is going to be basically one material. And the reason why I use the pen tool is because now I have a very precise block of color so that when I add details for that material on a new layer, I can select the pixels on that layer, and then I can add details only on that piece of material. And this is a good way to work in Photoshop because you can separate out the different materials in a sketch. And once you kind of do that upfront work, it saves a lot of time later on. So here what I've done for this middle part of the shoe, I made a new layer. I took the pen tool, and now I'm cleaning that up. So now I have two separate, you can see I'm turning the layers on and off. Now I have two separate layers of color because these are two different materials in the shoe. I'm going to come back and do the same thing for the sole of the shoe. So here I'm basically blocking out the color, and now I'm starting to play around with adding some texture to the different areas. So here I'm kind of doing the same thing for the base of the shoe. So this is the sole that's all foam. So this bottom layer is going to be all one material. Just filling that in with a solid color. Then I got to come back and clean up that selection a little bit, because it's hard to get everything perfect with the pen tool. So I'm filling in little areas that I didn't get on the first selection. Now I set that layer to multiply, so that allows the line work underneath to show through. So that way I can come back in and clean up the little areas like around the sole of the shoe that don't need the color. So I'm erasing that out. Basically getting a nice clean selection. So once I get that erased out, that sets me up to save a lot of time when I come back and add the light, the shadow, and the texture. You can see on the top layer, the upper part of the shoe, I've added some dark shading. And this shows where that upper sort of is sewn in to the layer in the middle. And it shows that the upper material is folding onto the inside of the middle part of the shoe. You can see on the top there, I've basically erased out the eyelets and the laces. So I've erased out everything that isn't the upper material, because I'm going to come back later and add the laces and the eyelets, because that's a separate material. And so now I'm coming back in and then adding another layer of detail by chopping out the top perimeter of the upper, because that's going to be another material as well. Just adding a bit more shadow around that layer to kind of separate the two parts. So now what I'm coming back and doing is I selected all the pixels of that middle part of the shoe, because I already did the work of making the selection. And then on top, I'm making a separate layer just for shadow. So usually when I do a render like this, I try to put all the shadows on one layer just to keep it simple. But I'm only selecting a certain area of the shoe at any one time to add the shadow. So here what I'm doing is making another selection, because what I'm going to do is make another layer for highlights. So I'll usually have the base color, and then on top of that, I'll have two layers, a shadow layer and a highlight layer. And what I try to do is keep all the highlights on one layer and all the shadows on another. So here I'm basically selecting the upper edge of the foam. So I know this surface is going to face upward, which means it's going to catch some of the light. So I'm adding a highlight here. It's pretty subtle, but I don't want to be too extreme with it, because the photo I was referencing has very soft, even lighting. So when you're doing a rendering, you don't always need to have extreme contrast on all the materials. Sometimes if you look at a shoe or an object in real life, the difference between the light and shadow can often be very subtle. So you don't always want to overdo it and make it super dramatic. Sometimes you just need a very subtle difference between light and shadow. So here I'm adding two more strips of highlight, kind of in the general areas that I know are tilted upwards. And what I'm going to do is come back and erase out little pieces from that highlight layer for the areas that are in shadow. Because you can see there's a bunch of little cuts and divots in the foam. So I'm just making the basic highlight shape first, and then I'm going to come back and erase the little tiny strips that are actually in shadow. Okay, so here now I've moved back to the shadow layer, and I'm basically doing the opposite. For all the surfaces of the foam that are facing downwards, I know those are going to be a little bit darker. So I'm adding black color to those. Usually I'll just take the regular plain Photoshop brush, I'll put it on 2 to 5% opacity. You don't need a whole lot. Then I have the hardness all the way down, so it's a very soft brush. And I'm just sort of very lightly painting in the areas of shadow. And I use a very low opacity brush because I want to be able to build up the layer. I don't want it to get too dark too quickly. So sometimes if you leave your brush on too high of an opacity, it's going to get muddy really quickly. And it's going to look like a really dark black brush, and it's really going to mess up the look of your shadow. So you want to be very subtle with it. Start lower than you think, just a few percent opacity, and just slowly build up that shadow. So now I'm going back to the highlight layer. I'm picking out a few little areas of detail where the materials meet. And on the top edge that's facing upward, I'm adding white because it's picking up light. And on small edges that face downward, I'm adding shadow. So that helps those small material transitions to pop a little bit better. So now I'm going in and selecting the eyelets of the shoe, some of those small details. I know those are going to be a separate material. So I'm making a new layer and then painting in the base color. And again, here when I'm adding the areas of light, I'm putting those on my original layer that I have for highlights. And here what I'm trying to do is to save a little bit of time. Because all those eyelets are the same, I just painted one of them and copy pasted them to the other positions. And so now I'm going back and separating out the tongue area of the shoe, putting that on a separate layer. I think here what I decided was that when I copy pasted the eyelet, it wasn't looking great because it didn't match the line work. So I just repainted that and then just added highlights to match each one. So it looks a little bit nicer compared to the line work. Sometimes these things, if I was doing this for an actual client, a little detail like that, I may not go to the trouble of painting each one individually. It's just a thing where if you can save time, sometimes it's nice to be able to just do one of these kind of details and then copy it out. Okay, so now I've got the basic colors laid out on the different materials of the shoe, and now I'm experimenting with adding some texture. And so this particular shoe or colorway that I found for the Tour Summit, the sole of the shoe, the foam has this speckled texture to it that kind of adds a little bit of color. So I found an interesting speckled brush that's standard in Photoshop, and I added that texture as a separate layer so that I can come back and adjust the opacity. And so for this middle part of the shoe here, I'm just using the same brush, but I just scaled it down quite a bit. And then I'm brushing it back and forth to add texture to the middle part. So I'm erasing it down to reduce the opacity so it's a little bit more subtle, because on the actual shoe, the texture there on that middle part is very light. So I didn't want to overdo it. And then when I take that texture that I brushed on there and I combine it with the light and the shadow layer, it starts to make that part of the shoe pop. Okay, now I'm kind of doing the same thing for the upper. I'm just selecting that. And then I'm using the filter gallery in Photoshop to apply a texture to that color itself. To make it a bit more subtle, I then duplicated that layer on the upper here, and then I started erasing out part of the upper layer because I want that texture to be more pronounced on the underside of the layer. So you can see where the eyelets hit the shoe are attached, where the eyelets are attached to the shoe, the texture is very subtle. Then on the lower part, where it meets the middle of the shoe, you can see that texture a little bit more pronounced where the shadow is. Okay, and on the top edge of the shoe, around the perimeter, I'm also adding texture here. And for this, I'm just adding noise in Photoshop. If you want a quick way to add texture to something, using noise is a pretty quick, simple way to make things look a little bit more realistic. And the noise texture just happened to match pretty close to the actual texture of the shoe. So for that, I'm just using noise because it's a close enough approximation. And then here to add the little perforations that are part of the shoe to let air flow through, I just made a new layer, made a simple arc of dots, and then I took that arc and just copy pasted it all the way across. Then duplicated it a couple times because it wasn't quite dark enough, and then erased out everything outside the material. So that kind of helps sell the idea of that perforated mesh that makes up that inner layer of the shoe. So now I'm coming back and adding some other details like the shadow created by the eyelets. It helps make the eyelets and the laces stand off of the background a little bit more. Now I'm coming back and adding a bit more shadow in between different materials because I know that the tongue of the shoe is sitting behind the upper there. So adding the shadow there adds some depth and shows that that tongue is sitting behind the upper of the shoe. So it adds more dimension to the sketch. Now I'm coming back in, adding some more shadows to some of the small little tiny details in the foam on the sole of the shoe. So there's certain small areas of overhang where some parts of the foam create shadow. So I'm adding more shadow in there to add some of the 3D texture of the sole. It's adding a bit of color to some of the logos there. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's just a pretty rough sketch, so I don't need to get super detailed. It just needs to get the basic idea across. So now I'm coming back in and just adding a drop shadow underneath the shoe. And this will be pretty easy to add in because I've already made that nice selection for the sole. All the divots on the sole have already been selected out. So all I have to do, once I've roughly painted in this shadow, is just drop the layer right behind the sole, and it's already ready to go. So I just painted the shadow with a pretty low opacity and just dropped it behind all the color of the shoe. So now the shadow is now on the bottom layer below the colors of the shoe. So I'm going back in. I've selected all the pixels of that upper again. Just adding a bit more highlight to the top edge. Now I'm coming back into the actual line work layer and erasing out some of those extra pin lines that aren't actually present on the shoe. Just cleaning up some of the small details in the hand sketch. So now I'm coming back in and then adding a new layer of color for the laces. And this is set on multiply so I can see through to the sketch below, so I can see where I'm painting. Now I'm just coming back in and finishing some of those small details, like underneath some of the loops, adding shadow, removing color and highlight where it shouldn't be, and just playing with the opacity of the different layers. So messing around with making some of the shadows darker, making some of the highlights brighter. Sometimes you can do this by either duplicating the shadow layer or basically erasing out some of the shadow to make it lighter. And the same thing with the highlights. I can either duplicate that highlight layer and then erase some of it out, or just start erasing a little bit from the highlight or the shadow layer. So that's basically it. It's a pretty straightforward process. This probably took about an hour, a little bit more in real time, and I just sped that up to basically simplify the process. So that's the basic idea of how I would do a sketch like this. You can either do the line work by hand or do it straight in Photoshop or on an iPad, and then I rendered this in Photoshop. Stay tuned and subscribe, and I'm going to put more videos like this up on the channel. Thanks.